Hello, welcome back to the Parc Fermé Parlay podcast with Kieran Downey, Spanish Grand Prix edition. What a race. What a race. It just seems to be that if we want an interesting race with lots to talk about, take the race off the calendar, because that's Imola and now Barcelona. This is the last year that we're visiting these tracks, and they've produced on equal measures good racing and messiness. Because I would say for Barcelona about 60-40. I would say about 40% of it was amazing racing, on-track action, and the other 60% was pure chaos, an utter mess, and has left us with probably one of the most controversial incidents this season. So we've got a hell of a lot to talk about today. Now, we didn't do a post-quali reaction because we were actually at a concert last night. We were at the Robbie Williams concert at Murrayfield, and it was absolutely insane. If you have the chance to go and see Robbie Williams, I highly recommend it because it was brilliant. I loved every second of it, but it did mean that I missed the qualifying. I watched it this morning before the race, so there are a few points that I want to touch on from qualifying, but there is so much to talk about in this race, especially with the sort of top four teams, that I don't want to spend too long on it. I also want to touch quickly on the new technical directive that was introduced from this Grand Prix onwards, which hasn't really had much of an effect on anything, to be honest with you. But I do want to touch on it just to sort of encapsulate the whole weekend before we get into each of the drivers' performances. So this new technical directive has been something that has been on the horizon for quite a while. We knew it was coming, and it is all relating to the front wings of the car. Now, from the Spanish Grand Prix in Barcelona onwards, the FIA has introduced a tougher load test on the front wing, including the front wing bodywork flexibility and the front wing flap flexibility. Now, the bodywork flexibility of the front wing has been reduced from 15mm under load to 10mm under load, and the flap flexibility has been reduced from 5mm to 3mm. Now, when you look at that, it seems like nothing. Like, if you take the bodywork flexibility, you're talking 5mm. What even is that? But to put it into perspective, it is a third of a difference. And I think coming into this race weekend, a lot of us thought that we would see massive difference in the performance of the cars due to this technical directive. I think we, especially the likes of McLaren, because these directives don't come in for no reason, and I'll come on to that in a second, but, we thought that McLaren was having such a dominance and, have been rumoured to be gaining advantages through the use of flexi wings, that perhaps this would really then slow them down and bring the other drivers behind into contention for race wins and, really sort of open up the championship a bit more. That wasn't really the case. McLaren had actually already been running their new front wing to comply with this new technical directive. So there was no real huge moment where we were like, oh, this is, changed so much. It hasn't really changed much that we can see. Now, why has this technical directive come in? So there were concerns raised throughout last season and the sort of beginning of this season that teams were gaining performance through the use of flexi front wings, which were changing the aerodynamic performance of the car through the low and high speed corners. And this technical directive is similar to the changes that were brought into the rear wing earlier this year in terms of its flexibility as well. Now, when I say that the flexi wings were altering the aerodynamic performance of the car, what I mean is that at high speeds it would effectively trim the wing, which would allow for higher speeds. When you apply the brakes to go around the corner, the wing would go back into position, putting the car back to the same sort of downforce spec to get round the slower corners, but at high speeds it effectively trims the wing, giving the car a little bit more downforce, making it go faster. Now, changes like this are nothing new to Formula One. It happens quite often that the FIA will introduce some sort of change to the technical regulations. They'll add in a new directive just to sort of curb any misuse, or not so much misuse, but any sort of curb any loopholes that might be within the regulations. As I said, this usually happens when the FIA believe that a certain team is benefiting too much from certain loopholes within the regulations, so they just want to kind of tighten it up. And usually it is because there is one team that is absolutely dominating, that is so fast ahead of everyone else in the field, and they try and close these loopholes to sort of bring everything, and they sort of close these loopholes to sort of bring the field back together. But as I said, it hasn't really changed much, and McLaren are still the fastest car, so the technical directive hasn't slowed McLaren down by any means. In fact, it potentially has made them faster. And that is everything on the new technical directive. Now, moving on to the race and the driver's performance, as always, kicking things off with Sauber. And we have Gabriel Bortoleto, who qualified 12th, finished 12th, and Nico Hülkenberg, who qualified 16th, started 15th, and finished 5th. I actually thought the results might have been slightly different. I did think that perhaps Bortoleto would maybe have finished ahead of Hülkenberg, because just due to on-track position from the qualifying, and I don't know, I think I might have slightly forgotten how good a racer Nico Hülkenberg is. I was quite shocked at Hülkenberg being out in P16. This is a man that he's one of the drivers that we call Mr. Saturday. He's known for having such a great qualifying performance. So I was a bit surprised to see him out in 16th. But in terms of his teammate Bortoleto, getting P12 in qualifying is absolutely insane. And I have to say, I think with Bortoleto, I think he's been unfairly slandered and judged when it comes to his performance this year. And listen, I hold my hands up. I have been judgmental of Bortoleto's performance, and I think we've all been maybe a bit quick to judge and judged him too harshly, because he is actually doing a great job out there. Yes, he's not lighting up the timesheets and he's not having huge big flashes of greatness where we go, that's why you're in F1, but he's actually doing a pretty decent job. He's not in the best of cars. There's a reason we call it a wheelie bin, and he is still a rookie. So, and I mean, arguably out of all the rookies, he is in the worst car out of those drivers. So it makes sense that he's not going to be having the performances like Isaac Hadjar or Antonelli or something like that, because they're in much better machinery. But, let's remind ourselves that this is a man that has won the F3 championship, won the F2 championship. He's the current Formula 2 champion. Like, the man is an incredibly good driver. I think we have all maybe rushed a little bit too quickly to judge him. And I hold my hands up to that. And I actually want to take it back, because I do think he is doing a great job. And I have to say that actually, for both those drivers, the straight line speed of that Sauber was no joke around Barcelona. Like, it looked pretty decent. And the race trim on it this weekend, not so bad, considering Nico Hülkenberg managed to get P5. A fucking P5 in that neon wheelie bin. Like, what is happening? He finished on the track P6, but because of Verstappen's penalty, he's obviously been bumped up a position. And I just cannot believe that Nico Hülkenberg in a kick Sauber got P5. It's wild. He had an absolutely brilliant start to the race. I think in the first lap he'd gained like 5 positions. And then he just had some brilliant on-track battles. Like, he wasn't afraid to get the moves done. He was absolutely sending it. And it was so good. I actually was loving watching it. And I never really enjoy watching the Saubers out on track, and haven't done for quite some time now, because it's always been so depressing. But actually, they were decent this weekend. But yeah, I had a lot of fun watching Nico Hülkenberg out on track today. He had some absolutely brilliant fights. I was saying there was a little scrap with Alonso at the beginning of the Grand Prix, which was just amazing. But a very good result for Sauber for Bortoleto to get a P12. That's impressive, and it's so close to the points, and it shows that things are moving in the right direction. But for Hülkenberg to go and get P5, like, what the fuck? Like, Jesus, well done, boys. Right, next up is Williams, and we have Alex Albon, who qualified 11th, did not finish, and Carlos Sainz, who qualified 18th, started 17th, finished 14th. I have to say, it was an absolute shocker for Williams this weekend. Like, is this maybe their worst performance so far this year? I think it might be. I think this might be their worst Grand Prix this year. If it's not, it's maybe a close second, because the whole weekend's just been an absolute car crash for them. You know, Sainz qualifying P18 is an absolute shocker. And, you know, when you're watching it and there's just like moments where you're like, yes, it seems to be all coming together. You know, Williams' trajectory is on the rise. Carlos has had a flash of brilliance and, you know, had a great qualifying and a great race. And then we come and we have performances like we've just had in Barcelona where you think, what has happened? What has happened here? Because, and I know, listen, I want to preference this as well by saying I know that Barcelona as a circuit is not actually a circuit that Williams like. Their car has never really suited Barcelona for quite some time now, and I don't know why when I did my predictions ever thought that Alex Albon would be on a podium, because I know that Williams actually their car just doesn't suit this track, so more fool me. But I just didn't expect a Q1 exit. I just absolutely no pace. He just didn't have it in him to get out of Q1, which is wild to me that was the case, because even with like Alex, who got into Q2, you know, he's qualified 11th, and I would look at that and maybe quite confidently say that is just the pace of the Williams around this specific track. They're not going to be lightning at every track, obviously, but I would say, yeah, that's the Williams. They might score a couple of points, but never did I think it would be a Q1 exit for Carlos. I was actually quite shocked by that one. And he isn't massively off Albon. You know, it's a couple of tenths between Sainz and Albon, but that's huge depending on where your car is in the pecking order. You know, Norris is 2 tenths behind Piastri, but he's lining up second on the grid. You know, the differences are much and such the same, but just depending on where your car lines up in that pecking order, it can be huge. I don't really have much to say about Carlos Sainz's race because it was just a very poor show, to be honest with you. Alex Albon, what a complete mess of a race that was for him. An absolute disaster. Collision with Liam Lawson on the opening lap, has a broken front wing, has to pit, get a new front wing, punts him down the back of the pack, and then you barely see him again until he has another collision with Liam Lawson into turn 1. Albon ends up with wing damage. He gets a 10-second time penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. He comes into the pits, he serves his penalty, he does another lap, he comes in, he retires the car. Very smart of Williams to make him serve his penalty before they retired the car. The call to retire came through, I think, just before they handed out the penalty. They brought him in, made him serve his penalty, got him out to do a lap, and then brought him back in to retire the car. If they hadn't, that would have carried on to Canada next week, where it would have materialised into, I think if they can't serve a time penalty that race and it carries on, it becomes a grid drop for the following week. So very smart of Williams just to get him in, get the penalty served, and just send him out to do one lap. We're going to retire the car anyway, it doesn't fucking matter. But just go and do a lap and come back in and we'll get you boxed. But yeah, very unfortunate race for Alex Albon. For the whole Williams team in general, as I said, just a complete shocker, and one they will definitely be wanting to forget pretty quickly. Next up is VCarb, and we have Liam Lawson, who qualified 13th, finished 11th, and Isaac Hadjar, who qualified 9th, finished 7th. I have to say, I'm just getting really, really irked that every race weekend I come on here and we get to Liam Lawson and I have to say that his race was messy and that his driving's messy, and I'm not that impressed by it because I'm just getting really bored of it, to be honest. I'm just getting really bored of every weekend having to say the words, it was a mess. He was messy, it wasn't that impressive, and it's just annoying because I know he's actually a good driver. And what I will say is that, yes, he did have some collisions. That second one with Alex Albon, when he dive-bombed Albon. So this was the thing. Lawson was just trying to dive-bomb everyone going into turn 1. And what really annoyed me was he's just dive-bombed Alex, and that move on Alex into turn 1 was a legitimate move. Not the first one at not the first one at the race start. That I put kind of down to a racing incident. You know, you've got 20 cars or 19 cars all going into one corner at the same time. Something's going to happen. There's always going to be some kind of contact. But when I look at that second incident, the one that forced Albon to retire the car after breaking his front wing, again, I look at that and I say, yeah, that was a legitimate move by Lawson. There's a reason that Albon was given a 10-second time penalty because Lawson's move was legit. He was ahead. Case closed, end of story, moving on. And then a few laps later, Lawson does the exact same thing again, tries to dive bomb Behrman into turn one. But the difference this time being, he's actually too far back to get the job done. So when they come into the corner, when they get to the apex, Behrman's still ahead of Lawson. Behrman and Lawson obviously make contact because of Lawson's late dive bomb. And I just think, what are you doing? Why are you doing that? It just really began to irk me. And like, as I said, Lawson's lunge on Albon was 100% legitimate, and the stewards penalising Albon shows that. I think that maybe gave Lawson a little bit of confidence that he could go and do that move again, that he could go and have another crack at it. Unfortunately, he was way too far back to get that move done correctly, and all it resulted in was a collision with Behrman. I actually think that Lawson should have gotten a penalty for that one. 100% that should have been a penalty. Then, later in the race, we're heading down to turn one again. Seemed to be like Lawson's little party trick. And I think I seen somebody saying that Behrman was just closing the door on Lawson coming into turn one and trying to cut him off. And actually, that I think a little bit of that might be true. Lawson had sort of moved to the inside and Behrman sort of came over and cut him off. But what I think is different about that, because it created a whole mess, by the way, this whole incident created an absolute shocker. But I think what was different from that is the blue flags were waving. There was all the front runners coming past. There was Oscar, Lando, Verstappen, Leclerc, like all these people were trying to get past at this point. Lawson is trying to get a move done whilst all of these people have the right of way. Behrman's moved out of the way to let the McLarens or Verstappen or whoever it was through. I actually think it was Lando, and it ended up in a complete mess where round turn 1, 2, 3, Lawson's still trying to battle it out with Behrman whilst Lando's trying to get through. And it was just a complete mess of a situation. And like, I understand what you're trying to do, but I also think, lads, and I do think that Behrman is a little bit at fault for that one as well, because I do believe there will be some kind of an element of trying to keep Lawson behind you whilst getting out the way. But at the end of the day, you all have to move out the way because it's a blue flag. As much as I'm not, 100% appreciative of a blue flag, I do think they have their time and place, but sometimes within the race setting, I kind of wish we could get away with them. I just think it would maybe be a little bit more spicy. But I do think that Lawson was not at the right time. But I do think Lawson was trying to get a move done on Behrman at completely the wrong time. Like, at least wait until the front runners have cleared you and then go on your merry way and try and get the moves done. Don't try and do it when you're coming into turn one whilst you're getting lapped. Doesn't seem like the smartest move in my eyes. And then we have Isaac Hadjar, who all I really have to say is I am so impressed by Isaac. I'm so impressed every race weekend right now. I'm so impressed with him. Yes, he's had his moments. He had that thing in Australia, and then where was it? I can't remember which one it was, but there was a race recently where Hadjar just didn't have the best of times. It can't have been Monaco because the way they did their strategy, so it must have been Imola or Miami. But there was a race where, he just didn't have the best time, and what I do quite like is that he just won't, or was it quali? I think it might have been a qualifying session that, he didn't have the best of times. Regardless, it doesn't fucking matter because he's had a great race. I'm so impressed by him because he's not letting, when he's having these issues and, you could see in Australia that he really beat himself up. You could see when he had that other incident, whatever it was, because it's totally escaped my mind, that he was really beating himself up. But he comes back stronger and more committed to just getting the job done and doing a brilliant performance. He is by far, right now at least, my rookie of the year. Like, absolutely insane. We'll kind of talk about this when we come on to speaking about Yuki Tsunoda, but just lightly touching on it, I've seen a lot of people in relation to Yuki and his seat at Red Bull saying, when is he getting punted and when is Hadjar getting moved into that seat? And just briefly before, as I said, I'll come on and talk about it a bit more when I get to Yuki and get and talk about his qualifying performance. But they cannot, if they see Yuki as just doing a short stint at the team before they can get Hajar into the seat, they cannot rush Hajar into that seat. I don't think they can put Hajar. I think the smart thing is to not put Hajar in that seat this year at all. Absolutely not. This is obviously a car that everyone is really struggling with. Even Max is struggling with the car at times. And I think if you see Hajar as being someone that you will have in that Red Bull team at some point, you know he will come and drive in that team. Leave him at VCarb where he's got a good car under him, get the points in, let him develop his skills as a driver and sort of become a bit more well-rounded before putting him in to a quite chaotic environment. Let's be honest, Red Bull is a bit chaotic at times, but in a car that is extremely difficult to handle. We've also got a huge regulation change next year, so there's no point, I don't think anyway, in doing a driver swap again for, you know, 2/3 of the season. If you want him to be a longer term driver, I think if you wanted to put Hajar in, you would put him in at the beginning of next year. And everybody's working off the same, you know, we're all on a standard line here. It's a huge regulation change, so we're all in the same boat. But as I said, I'll come on and talk more about, I wasn't going to say that much there, but I'll come on and talk more about it when we come and talk to Yuki. And moving on to the Haas drivers, and we have Esteban Ocon, who qualified 17th, started 16th, finished 16th, and Oliver Bearman, who qualified 15th, started 14th, finished 17th. I don't really have much to say about Haas, to be honest with you. Obviously, a very poor qualifying performance from Esteban Ocon. There's just something weird going on with Ocon because he sort of goes and has a great weekend, and then he won it, he's into a poor weekend, and then he won it, he's into a great weekend. Like, it's almost like banger, poor, and it just alternates each weekend. As I said before, there is something with Haas where at least one of the drivers has to have a really poor qualifying. I don't know what it is, but for so many races this year, there's always been one driver that has been at the back of the grid. Usually it's Bearman, but they like to take it in turns. So yeah, I think just an all-round quite poor performance from Haas this weekend. They just didn't have the pace in the car to really, well, I mean, in qualifying, they just didn't have the pace to go and get any higher up. That the timings don't lie. But then in the race, they just kind of languished about. They were never really there. There was some decent on-track battles. As I said, Bearman liked to get his elbows out. He was having a bit of a scrap with Lawson quite a few of the times, and I've already sort of covered that incident with the blue flags when we spoke about Lawson, but on the whole, just a not great weekend for Haas either. Moving on to Alpine, and we have Pierre Gasly, who qualified 8th, finished 8th, and Franco Colapinto, who qualified 19th, started 18th, finished 15th. I feel a little bit bad for Franco Colapinto, especially when it came to his qualifying, because he was out in Q1 with a mechanical failure in the car. He was coming out to do his second flying lap and the car just failed him. He couldn't even get out the pits. And when I look at that, I don't think, because I've seen people say, oh, Colapinto's no better than doing with these performances and all this kind of stuff. And I have to say, Colapinto being out 19th is not a true reflection of his qualifying performance. Like, we know he can do better than that. This is not him. This is the car. It failed him. What I will say, however, is I think both these boys just kind of, you know, Colapinto was sort of doing some races and stuff out there, but he was just languishing about at the back, like never really managed to make an impression, never really managed to climb up the grid massively. It was always just kind of at the back. I think Pierre Gasly's done a great job in getting 8th. I never really seen them on the broadcast. They were never really showing. They never had any big moments, I think, because so much of it was tied up with this battle at the front and then some of the other just big chaotic moments that Alpine kind of just flew under the radar a little bit, which is not the worst thing for a team that has had quite a lot of attention. And, you know, Colapinto's had a crash and all of this kind of stuff and had quite a poor performance in Monaco. And I think having a decent race for Gasly where he's gotten a bit of points, because right now he is their main point scorer. And you know, Colapinto, it's now his 3rd race in. He's beginning, I think, to get a grip of things, and he is going to have to start performing pretty quickly. I can't see him being out of a race seat this year. Like, he'll finish the year. I don't see them swapping anyone out. They can't afford to keep swapping them out because they're going to run out of drivers, not in terms of the drivers that they could get in the seat, but they're going to run out of the amount of times they're allowed to swap a driver out. So yeah, a kind of tale of two halves from Alpine. Some nice little points in the bag for Gasly, and just a bit of a meh performance for Colapinto. As I said, really just flew under the radar. Both the drivers did, to be honest with you. Not the worst thing for Gasly, however. Next up is Aston Martin, and we have Lance Stroll, who qualified 14th, did not start the race, and Fernando Alonso, who qualified 10th and finished 9th. So we can wrap up Stroll's race pretty quickly because he didn't race. Last night after the qualifying session, Aston Martin released a statement saying that Lance Stroll had decided to withdraw from the Spanish Grand Prix. The statement from Aston Martin read, "Over the past 6 weeks, Lance has been experiencing pain in his hand and wrist, which his medical consultant believes is in relation to the procedure he underwent in 2023. As a result, his medical team have confirmed that he will not race tomorrow and he will undergo a procedure to rectify these issues before focusing on his recovery." Now, if you cast your minds back to 2023, at the start of the year, remember Lance broke both his wrists in a bicycle accident, I believe it was, and within 2 weeks was back in his race car racing, and we all thought, you're a madman, like, surely he's not recovered that much. And he did say that when he went back to racing that he was really struggling with the pain in his wrists. Now, obviously Aston Martin have said that over the last 6 weeks, Lance has been suffering this pain related to that procedure back in 2023, and obviously he's going to get another procedure to get that fixed. Now, Aston Martin couldn't then go and tap one of the reserve drivers to replace Lance Stroll for today's Grand Prix because he had already done a qualifying session. He'd already set the time. They can't bring another driver in because they've not set a time. They've not qualified. The rules don't work like that, so unfortunately Aston Martin only ever had one car to race with this weekend when Lance Stroll pulled out of the Grand Prix. Now, what I find really interesting about the whole thing is the fact that this has been going on for 6 weeks, that they've known that this has been a problem. If Lance Stroll was struggling for 6 weeks, why did they not put Drugovich in the car for the qualifying session? Obviously, as I said, he can't race because Stroll did the quali, but if there was any doubt about Lance Stroll not being able to take part in the race, why didn't they just put Drugovich in and avoid the risk of only having just one car in the race? They really shot themselves in the foot by not actively looking at the situation and just problem solving it, being like, right, you're really suffering here. You've been suffering for 6 weeks. Go and get whatever it is sorted. Go and speak to the medical team. Go and do what you need to do. If you need to get the procedure, that's fine. Get whatever it is that you need done. Get in recovery and then, come back when you're ready. We've got a reserve driver, a very good reserve driver in Felipe Drugovich. He's here. They've got quite a few. They've got Stoffel Van Dorn and stuff, but he's in China racing for the Formula E. They've got Felipe Drugovich. He's ready to go. We'll put him in whilst you go and get what you need to get done. I just don't understand why Aston Martin didn't actively avoid this situation where they had to run one car. We've obviously got 2 weeks now until the Canadian Grand Prix. Felipe Drugovich has apparently said he is ready to step in should Lance Stroll not be available to race at his home race because of the recovery on his wrists. However, that would interfere with the 24 Hours of Le Mans, which Felipe Drugovich is competing in for the World Endurance Championship. So I think he has said that should this come along, he would just drop the Endurance Championship and just go and race in Formula One. I think that makes sense. He's obviously dead set. He wants to be an F1 driver. And, there's been quite a big span of time that he's not been competing in single-seaters. So if he got the chance to show what he can do that's not a FP1 session, then he's obviously going to take it a competitive session. But yeah, I just think Aston Martin could have handled that one a little bit better. And then we have Fernando Alonso, who, thank fuck, scored his first points. Thank God he managed to get points this weekend in front of his home crowd. I actually didn't think he would at one point. I thought, it's all gone tits up. He's not going to be able to score any points. and it's just going to be another depressing weekend for Alonso, and we're all going to continue to call him the unluckiest driver. Thank God he's managed to score some points. I think Alonso had a brilliant weekend out there. Thank God is all I have to say that Alonso scored points, because I really don't think I could have done another. I don't think I could have done another predictions where I had to say Fernando Alonso scores his first points. I think I'd rather just not make predictions at all than have to continue saying that. But thank God he's actually scored some points. And what a way to do it. What better place to do it than at your home race. So panic over. I thought he was going to have a pointless campaign this year, but thank God for that. And I actually reckon it's not the last time, because as I said, the upgrades on that car are decent. Fernando's obviously, it's Fernando Alonso, phenomenal driver, so I do reckon we'll see some more points in the later races this year. Moving on to Mercedes, and we have George Russell, who qualified 4th, finished 4th, and Kimi Antonelli, who qualified 6th, did not finish. It was nice to see Mercedes sort of back in the fight this weekend after their dismal performance out in Monaco, but again, not a stellar performance. You know, you look at George Russell and he's lost some positions on the jump through that sort of run down to turn 1, and then the sort of turn 1, 2, 3, and then you can hear him over the radio and you can tell he's frustrated by it. And what I want to know is, obviously we got the message on the broadcast where Russell was complaining about something, and it was Toto Wolff that came back over the radio and was just like, right, focus, George, like just focus on what you're doing. And I just do not believe that that one message is what brought Toto Wolff over the radio. I want to know what was happening on that radio that it then meant that Toto Wolff was like, I can't listen to this anymore. I'm going to have to step in. Like, how much was George complaining over the radio before Toto Wolff stepped in and said, George? Because I do not believe for 1 second that it was just that one message that Toto was like, I'm going to have to reply to this. There has to have been a string of messages, and I just really want to listen to them. I think for Russell, it was a much better drive on his part this weekend, and I will refrain myself from talking about it right now because I'm going to talk about it when we get to Max. But obviously that incident with Verstappen, or those two incidents with Verstappen, because there was one at turn 1, there was one at turn 5. The turn 5 incident we'll talk about when we talk about Max, because that was just outrageous from Max Verstappen. But the turn 1 incident was George's fault. Let's be completely honest. It was absolutely George's fault. Definitely George's fault. Now, when you look at the onboards and the replays and everything, you can see that Russell was actually ahead of Verstappen. Russell's front axle was ahead of the mirror of Verstappen at the apex. However, it wasn't a legitimate overtake because Russell lost control of his car. He wasn't in control of it. He'd gotten into the dirty air of Leclerc. It unsettled the car. He then caused a bit of a collision with Verstappen, who had to take to the runoff road to avoid the incident getting any further, and retained the position. Now, we'll talk about this obviously because this whole incident leads into what happened at turn 5. But the stewards have come out and said that Verstappen didn't need to give the place back. He's received no penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. So remember that when we come and talk about the other incident, because it makes it even more wild. But that turn 1 incident was 100% George Russell's fault. And I'm actually surprised that he didn't get anything for it, because he wasn't in control of his car when he was trying to get the overtake done and when he made contact with Verstappen. As I said, a bit of a better weekend for George Russell after the farce of last weekend. However, still not a great race, but it's some decent points in the bag for the World Drivers' Championship. Unfortunately for Mercedes and the Constructors' Championship, Russell was the only one that scored points this weekend, where both Ferrari drivers did, and it actually has meant that Ferrari have jumped Mercedes in the Constructors. We'll do a quick rundown of the standings when we get to the end of the episode. But as I said, only one driver finished for Mercedes, Kimi Antonelli. Unfortunately, on one hand, I'm kind of glad for him, but on the other hand, I'm devastated for him. Devastated that he had to retire from the race, but very glad that it was through no fault of his own. Unfortunately for him, he was coming to turn 10 and the car just lost power. The engine just failed on him and he took to the gravel, and that was him retired from the race. They had to safety car the race to get the crane out, to get it lifted off, and then obviously we had the safety car restart, and we all know what happened there. So Kimi Antonelli gave us a little bit of a late spice, shall we say. little sprinkle of spice right at the end just because Kimi Antonelli's engine failed. So you could really say that the chaos from the safety car was caused by Mercedes, because without it, we would have even had the safety car. What I will say with the safety car is that, Hamilton came over the radio and was like, they really do love wasting laps. And I have to say, I do think that maybe we went on a lap too long, because the car had been recovered. They then get the crane off the track. And at that point, I thought, should be good to go. They obviously do the thing that they do all the time where they let the lapped cars go back. And I don't know why they decided to continue behind the safety car to really just allow these guys to catch up, because the cars behind the safety car were towards the end of the track. The lap cars were basically at the beginning of the track. Does it really matter that they were all bunched up behind it? And I think it was Crofty or Rosberg that made a joke being like, that'll be Alonso on the blower being like, this cannot start till I'm at the back of the pack in front so I can get a jump on. And that obviously would have benefited Alonso as well, but I do think that we were just wasting laps behind the safety car. All right, moving on to Red Bull, and we have Yuki Tsunoda, who qualified 20th, started from the pit lane, finished 13th. And Max Verstappen, who qualified 3rd, finished 4th, but received a 10-second time penalty, which demoted him down to 10th. Now, we're going to talk about Yuki Tsunoda first, because we've got a lot to talk about Max. So let's talk with Yuki first, and then we'll move on to the big juicy stuff and the real moments from this race. What a shocker for Red Bull and Yuki Tsunoda, I have to say. A P20 qualifying for Yuki is off the rails. It's absolutely insane. There was just nothing there. His lap was atrocious and he had zero pace and he was obviously struggling and dead last on the road. I just didn't see it coming, and this is nothing new, unfortunately, to that second seat at Red Bull. Perez was always languishing at the back in qualifying, apart from 1 or 2 races. Lawson was qualifying 20th and, maybe a few places, give or take. Well, you can't really go below 20. Anyway, Lawson and Perez were struggling with this car, and that was sort of their performances. And when we got Yuki, we thought this is maybe going to be the turning point. And it's just more and more reinforcing that there is serious issues with that car, because that is now, granted, Perez has obviously never driven the RB21. RB21? Yes, sorry, the RB21, I was getting confused there. Perez obviously never drove it, but it is only just an evolution of a car that Perez did drive, the RB20, and he's really struggled with that because they've not done huge changes to it because we've only got 1 year of the regulations. So it's not massively different, and there's something about this car that is extremely tricky to handle, that these drivers just cannot get hold of it. And there's all this talk about, the second seat of Red Bull's cursed and all this kind of stuff. And yes, it can sort of seem that way, but there's a serious underlying issue, because even Max is struggling with this car. And when we spoke about Yuki getting the Red Bull gig, and we were like, listen, he can never turn down an opportunity from a top team, and I still stand by that 100%. And I said in it that, if he goes there and he absolutely nails it, and, he's right beside Max and he's scoring points every week, we'll all say Yuki Tsunoda's the GOAT. If he's qualifying 20th and not really scoring points, we'll say it's definitely the car. We're obviously doing the former. It's definitely an issue with the car here, because we know the quality, we know the pedigree of a Yuki Tsunoda. He's an incredibly good driver, and there's just something with this car. And it's just shocking. The car is shocking, because this is every second driver now just cannot perform. And listen, Yuki he's had moments where you think, okay, here we go, but there's no moments of greatness where you're like, fuck, Yuki in that car. It's always just a bit meh and a bit mediocre, and you're like, okay, well, he's still quite a bit away from Max. But as I said, even Max is coming out and saying that it's not Yuki, it is the car, because I've seen a lot of people saying, well then, when is Yuki Tsunoda going to get dropped from Red Bull, because he's obviously not performing. And I think Red Bull, as I said, when I sort of talked about Isaac Hadjar, Red Bull have to keep Yuki Tsunoda to the end of the year. They cannot switch him out. They just can't do it, because one, they would end up being close to a situation like you've got at Alpine, where they're swapping drivers out too much and then you run out of times you're able to do that. But at this point, I actually think that Red Bull just need to throw in the towel on the constructors. They're not going to win it, let's be honest. Nobody, I think, is going to come close to McLaren now. They are light years ahead of everyone else. But at this point, I think Red Bull just need to throw everything towards Max Verstappen and his Drivers' Championship bid. They have to forget about the constructors and just throw everything at Max and that Drivers' Championship, because one title is better than no titles. And listen, as I said, when we spoke about Isaac Hadjar, there is no reason for them to not look at Hadjar. He's an incredibly talented driver, and I definitely do believe that they maybe see him being a future Red Bull driver. But unfortunately, as I said, they need to hang fire on getting him in that car. They need to not rush him into it. As I said, if they want to put Isaac Hadjar in soon, 2026 might be an option with the huge reg change. But then I would also counter-argue that and say, well, doesn't Yuki Tsunoda deserve a chance to drive what potentially could be a much easier car to drive? We've seen the performances he can do in the V-Carb. That is a much easier car to drive. But, Yuki is also a talent, and I do think he deserves the chance to come into 26 driving the Red Bull on an equal footing with everyone else, because it's a huge reg change and there's no preferential setups towards the driving style of one driver. It's all going to be sort of middle of the road at this point. And I do think it's only fair to give Yuki that chance, but then it is Formula One, and Formula One's not always fair. I will say as well that Yuki must be absolutely exhausted. He must be exhausted from putting all of his energy into really trying hard to get points and to, have good performances with this car, and it failing and it not working, and then having to field the media questions, field the social media and the internet and everything, questioning his ability and whether he should be dropped and all this kind of stuff. And he'll be exhausted coming in and having to put a smile on it and just sort of give the media spin of, like, we're working on it, we're doing this, when actually they probably don't have a clue really how to sort it out. And he's probably just, as I said, he'll be absolutely exhausted. And I hope that the cracks don't end up showing like they did with Perez, where you could tell he was just completely broken, like what we could start to see happening with Lawson, where he was just a shell of the driver that we know, because he was just so exhausted and broken by the whole experience. In saying that they should throw everything behind Max, I think they kind of did today, because Yuki was so far out of it that he was never really going to be of any help to the team. They put him on the 3 pit stop strategy. It didn't work for him, and he spent most of his time chilling down the back of the pack, fighting a Haas. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's just a bit depressing. All right, moving on to Max, and I'm going to try and keep this as concise as possible, because I tend to get myself a bit wound up and I tend to maybe wander off a little bit, and then I just feel like I'm waffling at you for ages with no clear points. So what we'll do is we'll talk about the sort of overall race, and then we'll talk about, we've already sort of discussed the turn 1 incident with George. We'll talk about the Leclerc incident on the safety car restart, and then we'll talk about the incident with Max and George towards the end of the race. It was a pretty decent start for Verstappen. He did manage to capitalise on a quite poor start from Norris. He got himself up to P2, and it really then just sort of became, can Max chase Piastri down without really hurting his tyres? Everyone was starting on the soft tyres apart from Yuki Tsunoda, and there was a real thing of, just remember, you're on a soft tyre here. You don't want to pit too early, because if you do, you potentially then put yourself onto a 3-stop. And I know Max did end up going to a 3-stop, and quite a lot of the drivers did, but at that point there was a real question mark of, is the 3-stop going to work? Because it's obviously not the fastest way to do this race. A 1-stop is near enough impossible, because the hard tyre just doesn't work around here. But we might need to try something different, because the McLarens are definitely most likely going to do a 2-stop. And I have to say, I think he did a pretty decent job. He sort of clung to the back of Piastri for ages before he kind of had to back off just ever so slightly. And this is where you can tell the big differences between the McLaren and the Red Bull. Like, the McLaren is obviously the faster car and stuff, but McLaren is just so much kinder to its tyres. It's so much better on its tyres because Verstappen then just literally lost all the grip compared to that of Lando and Oscar that had that grip there. And you could see it as he was sort of navigating through the high-speed corners, the car just sort of twitching on him because he had no grip in his tyres. And a prime example of just how much Max was struggling out there was when Norris came to get the overtake done on him into turn 1, and Verstappen just didn't even bother trying to defend it. He was like, I'm not even going to try because there's no point. He's got the faster car. He's much better tyres than me. Let him go. I don't know whether his race might have been different if he had maybe tried to defend that position and, really sort of put a bit of a battle in there, but it sort of seemed like Red Bull and Max had sort of ceded the fact that they weren't really in the battle with the McLarens at this point, that their race was really changing and that the race wasn't ahead of them, their race was behind them, and that they were actually then going to have to start defending from those behind because they were never going to be able to catch up and attack the two McLarens in front. And it felt like their whole race dynamic shifted, and it sort of got brought back to life in the later stages when they decided to go to the 3-stop. They then really started to apply the pressure, got McLaren a bit twitchy and a bit nervous, and they then started having to respond. And then obviously we got the safety car restart, which really brought him into contention, but obviously just didn't go his way. Obviously, Verstappen's early stops gave him sort of a short-term gain because as the other drivers then came in to do their pit stops, it put him into the race lead, but it was short-term gain, long-term pain. I hate myself that I've just said that. Oh, I've given myself the ick. Yeah, it was short-term gain, long-term pain because, he had the race lead, but the McLaren was on much fresher tyres and well into the 2-stop. Verstappen wasn't able to do a 2-stop. He couldn't have clung on to it. So he was already set on a 3-stop. They wasn't going to be able to change it, unfortunately. And, they pitted him again. They confirmed he was on the 3-stop. And he then just really sort of went at it. And it was quite nice to see McLaren actually a little bit nervous, a bit twitchy because of the performance that Verstappen was having on these fresher tyres. And, he was the 3-stop, and will he cause us a bit of bother? And, you could tell with Verstappen and GP and Red Bull, they were sort of playing a little bit of a mind game on McLaren with just how they were communicating over the radio and what the team was feeding, what information they were feeding Max. Very clearly knowing that anything they say, McLaren will be able to hear it. So they are very clever. Red Bull is one thing Red Bull do very well is they lay little seeds of doubt, and they're very clever at the information they feed in so that they can begin to get other teams a little bit nervous. Obviously, Verstappen's on-track performance was part to play in that as well. We then obviously got the safety car, and all the drivers sort of dove into the pits, and everybody sort of put on softs, whether it was fresh or new. In fact, I don't think anybody had new softs. I think everybody was on used, and they stuck Verstappen on hards, and I thought that was a bit of an odd one because there was only, 6 laps left? And he came over the radio and he asked GP, and GP was like, it was the only tyre option we had. And I actually think at this rate, sticking on a used tyre would have been better than a hard. I actually think leaving him out there on the tyres he was on would have been more beneficial than bringing him in and putting him on a hard tyre that by the time he gets that warmed up and into a working window, the race is probably going to be over. And nobody really ran the hard tyre because it just wasn't the tyre that the drivers felt most comfortable in. That was obviously the medium, and the soft was performing decent as well, but the hard just didn't have anything. It took too long to get the grip in, and as I said, by the time the sort of tyre came into the working window, the fucking race was over anyway. So it was a very bizarre decision from Red Bull as to why they put him on hards when there wasn't that much left of the race anyway. As I said, we've obviously already spoken about the Turn 1 incident with George and Max. Let's talk about Leclerc and Verstappen. Obviously on the safety car restart, Verstappen was coming around that final corner and he was just a little bit wide and had a snap of oversteer, and this is how I will confidently say that Max Verstappen is a very good driver, because the fact that he managed to just get that car back on the track and cause no real big incidents is amazing, because it was, it was a pretty big snap of oversteer. The car was pretty much sideways on the track. It really then brought Leclerc into it, right up behind Max. He had the slipstream. He was a bit of the faster car because Verstappen's snap of oversteer had really just knocked it out of him. So he's ahead of Max. He's pushing Max to the left ever so slightly because, one, Leclerc needs to be on the left to be on the racing line going into turn one, the preferred racing line. And he's just trying to squeeze Max into just backing out so Leclerc can get a clean run of it. Unfortunately, they did end up making contact. Now, and it kind of erupted on social media. Because when Verstappen got the 10-second time penalty for his collision with Russell at turn 5, everyone was saying, well, Leclerc should get a penalty for his collision with Verstappen. And I had kind of gone on to say, well, it's just a racing incident. And they were like, absolutely not. He said in his post-race interview that he was pushing Verstappen to the left. And it's like, yeah, he was trying to squeeze Max. And yes, it was a bit of a risky move, and even the stewards have said that actually the collision was avoidable and that it could have caused a pretty major and quite serious crash. But they didn't deem one driver to be wholly or predominantly responsible for the collision. They deemed it to be sort of equal, because Max could have just backed out the move. Leclerc was ahead of him. Leclerc could have maybe not tried to squeeze Max out. Do you know what I mean? All these different things. But as I said, it's no further action. It's a racing incident. So that one's pretty easy. Racing incident, no further action, thank you, Your Honour. We then get into the incident with George Russell, and as I said, Verstappen is cleared of leaving the track and gaining an advantage because Russell is to blame for him being forced off the track. He's lost control of his car, he's made contact, Verstappen has to take, sort of evasive maneuvers to avoid a bigger crash. What I don't understand is, if the stewards have deemed him to have done nothing wrong, he's not left the track and gained an advantage, a lasting advantage. He doesn't need to give a position back to Russell. Why Red Bull then asked Max to cede the position to George Russell? Why GP came over the radio and said, Max, you need to give Russell that position back? And I don't know whether they were maybe taking and playing it a bit safe after the likes of Saudi Arabia earlier in the year, where Verstappen and Piastri into turn one took to the runoff and did leave the track and gain a lasting advantage. He managed to, create a bit of a gap. Unfortunately, the penalty that he got meant that he finished behind Oscar Piastri in the race. I think what Red Bull were trying to do was avoid that situation of having a penalty imposed on him, even though there was nothing from the stewards to say that Verstappen would be getting a penalty anyway. I think, when we only hear the conversation from GP to Max, and it's obviously not GP's call. There is a whole team of strategists at the race and at the factory in Milton Keynes that will be making these calls to say Max needs to cede that position. It's just GP's the one that tells him. So it is confusing as to why Red Bull decided to tell Max to cede the position. Max is obviously furious at this point. Furious about that huge snap of oversteer on the safety car restart. He's furious about the collision with Charles Leclerc. He's furious about the whole incident that's just happened with George Russell, where he's had contact and been pushed off the track. All of these things are built up, so he's already so angry, and then Red Bull tell him to cede a position that he doesn't actually need to, which causes him to erupt even more. And then we get to an incident where Verstappen slows down before turn 5, and it looks like he is slowing down to allow George Russell to get past into that corner, and that is him ceding the position. And it's almost like he changes his mind and thinks, fuck this, I'm not actually doing this. I know I'm in the right, because that is one thing about Max Verstappen, is he understands those regulations down to an app. That rule book, he's got it down to a T. He knows what he can and can't do on track, and what will give him a penalty and what won't. And he doesn't believe that he needs to cede this position, and this time he is correct. So he then just goes into the corner with a bit too much speed. He can't take the corner correctly. Him and George Russell collide. And then you've got Nico Rosberg, who's doing commentary for Sky this weekend, saying that's intentional, that's a black flag, he needs to be disqualified from this race. He is intentionally driving into other cars, and that's just not on. And I think the big question obviously is, Did Max Verstappen deliberately drive into the side of George Russell? Do I think it was deliberate? No, I actually don't. When I watched it first, I thought Max has lost his goddamn mind. He's deliberately driving into the side of George Russell because he's annoyed about the incident at turn one and him having to cede a position that he doesn't actually have to cede because the stewards don't do. Anyway, what I think is more likely the case is Verstappen being told he needs to cede the position and he thinks, right, fine, I'll do it. He slows down and then I think he just has a complete change of mind. He's like, nah, I'm not doing this. And then he, hits the accelerator. But unfortunately, he's so close to the corner that he ends up carrying so much speed into the corner and he can't turn the car properly, which results in him hitting George Russell because George also thinks that Verstappen has slowed down to let him past. And listen, it'll be a topic of conversation that completely splits the fan base. There'll be people that say, no, absolutely not. He's not done that on purpose. And there'll be people that say he should have been disqualified because that 100% was on purpose. I actually put up a poll, and out of the 148 people that have voted on it so far, 55% of you believe that Max Verstappen should have been given a bigger penalty for his collision with George Russell. Now, if you look at it in the case of just the crash, none of the other factors around it, the penalty would be sufficient because of that thing of not being fully in control of your car because he's gone into that corner with so much speed. And listen, I don't think he was doing it on purpose. I don't think it was malicious. And I really hope I am right in this because if I am wrong and he was doing it on purpose, I will, my opinion on Max would really, really change. And I'm trying to sort of stick to the middle ground on this because I don't believe that he was doing it out of malicious intent and I don't believe that he was doing it on purpose. I do believe, however, that it was reckless. And whether or not he wanted to collide with George, I can't believe that he did. It was a reckless move that he should never have done. And that is the thing about Max. Max is an incredibly talented driver, but the moves that he makes sometimes take away from how good of a driver he actually is. You look at moves like Imola a few weeks ago, that move on Oscar Piastri into turn one was one of the best moves we've seen in quite a long time. But then you look at this move and you think, what the fuck are you playing at? And it's the same last year. He was doing some incredible races and incredible moves out there, but then was becoming a little bit messy in other races. And it just detracts from just how good a driver Verstappen really is. And what's worse is that these moves that Verstappen starts pulling hurt no one other but himself and his team. He's cost himself and Red Bull a load of points today. And this will actually be something that we talk about most likely at the end of this year. This will be something that towards the end of this year, when the championship sort of all been shaken out and the positions are decided, we will look back at this race and say, did that incident with George Russell resulting in his 10-second penalty, did that cost Max on a much bigger scale? And listen, I've seen the argument saying Max is a terrible driver and all this kind of stuff and he's incompetent, and I really have to disagree because anyone saying that Max is a bad driver or an incompetent driver, I think is being incredibly disingenuous about their feelings on Max. But it doesn't excuse him from the criticism and the consequences of his actions. And I don't like what he did with Russell, but I don't believe he did it out of malicious intent. So obviously there is some blame on Max's part for that incident with George. He obviously got a 10-second time penalty. He's been given 3 penalty points on his licence, which takes him to a total of 11 out of 12. And he has 2 races before 2 points come off his licence. It's the 30th of June where 2 points from last year expire. So he has 2 races where he needs to be on his best behaviour because he could face a race ban. I also have to say that in the document, there's nothing to say from the stewards that they believe that Max Verstappen pulled the move on Russell on purpose, with malicious intent or anything. So I think that in itself is enough reason to lay that argument to bed that he was doing it on purpose. Next up is Ferrari, and we have Lewis Hamilton, who qualified 5th, finished 6th, and Charles Leclerc, who qualified 7th, finished 3rd. I don't have huge things to say about Lewis Hamilton. I just have to say that it is incredibly hard to watch him out there. He just had absolutely zero pace on him, and it was actually quite a struggle to watch him just be so slow. And I also caught his post-race interview with Rachel in the media pen as I was setting everything up, and he just looked broken. He just looked so incredibly like gone, like there was nothing there, like his fight had left. And Rachel had said, it's quite hard to see you like this, and he was like, well, I don't know what you want me to say, like I've just had a bad weekend. And I'm not blaming you, I'm just saying I've had a bad weekend. I don't know what you want me to say. I don't want, like, I don't feel cheery right now. And it is incredibly hard to see him like that, and I hope that him and Ferrari can sort of find out what's happening and he can get back up in this. I don't think he's washed. I don't think he's over. I just think he's going through a bit of a slump. And I hope that next year we've got completely new cars and we can almost start fresh. Charles Leclerc, a brilliant race from Charles Leclerc, to be honest with you. They seem to have sort of nailed his strategy. He was always sort of hanging there in that sort of P4, P5 position. And I did think that P4 was maybe going to be the best that he could do, but obviously managed to capitalise on that bit of an incident, that snap of oversteer that Verstappen had, that he could get alongside, and then just off he goes. And then also could capitalise on the fact that George Russell was trying to get past Verstappen as well, and that caused a bit of an incident, which allowed Leclerc just to off he goes. But yeah, I didn't feel depressed watching Ferrari this race, which is really nice change. Even right from the get-go, from lights out, Leclerc gained like 2 positions, and I was like, maybe this isn't going to be as bad as I predicted. Like, I thought that Monaco was just going to be like a bit of a weird outlier because it's such a unique circuit and stuff, that it would be grand and the rest would be shite. But actually, they sacrificed their qualifying. I will say that Leclerc sacrificed his qualifying position for his race. It meant that he had an extra set of fresh mediums. They had like an out lap and an in lap on them. There was nothing really, they weren't brand spankers new, like, but they were not used. And it was obviously the right decision. The car is not great in qualifying, so I think if they can sacrifice a little bit but gain in the race pace, because the race trim of that Ferrari is decent. So we'll see what happens when we go to Canada in 2 weeks' time, but maybe that's the way it sort of goes. We've seen them do that before. They sort of did it last year where they sacrificed their quality to benefit their race, and it kind of worked for a few of the races. So let's see what happens. But I wasn't depressed. And finally, we have the McLaren drivers with Lando Norris, who qualified second, finished second, and Oscar Piastri, who qualified first, finished first. In terms of Lando's quality, he definitely could have been on pole, but when he went to do his second flying lap, he overdid his lap after turn one. He went wide, he was offline, he had a few extra snaps, and it resulted in him being 2/10 down, and that meant that it was a P2 start for Lando. It is, however, a McLaren 1-2, so you can't argue with that if you're Team McLaren. And then we get to the race, and the big question is what is going to happen in turn one, because it's a long run down, and can Norris just sort of slip past him, and is Norris going to do some big bold move to take the lead? And you just sort of, you get yourself excited for it, and then I sort of sit there and I look back on it and I think, well, no, he's not actually, because he still needs to try and protect his position in the championship. He could have done some crazy move and written himself out the race, and that then just opens up everyone behind him to close that gap up. So he needs to play it safe. As much as he wants to go out there and win the race, he needs to then play it safe, which is why he ended up losing a couple of positions, because he can't put too much on the line, because he could end up screwing himself over way more than playing it a little bit safe and then sort of biding your time and then picking the cars back off. He's in the fastest car. He can afford to maybe lose a position slightly to then go and gain it back. The only bad thing about that is if his teammate's in front of him, he's probably not getting past his teammate, because the exceptional pace that Oscar Piastri now has in terms of his race trim. But yeah, in terms of the actual race, obviously a very decent race from Norris. But in terms of the race, McLaren played it perfectly. It's obviously a brilliant result for them, coming home 1-2. Oscar, just quickly, absolutely dominated when it mattered. That qualifying session, purple sectors all round, and he's, 2/10 up on Norris. And then you get to the race trim and, Piastri just was gone. He was cleanly in the lead. He never really was put under too much pressure. And even towards the end, McLaren were doing the right thing of, they could have put Piastri first and then Norris, but it would have probably meant that when they came out, the position would have been swapped. So you do it in a certain way that you can protect the standing order as it is. And then obviously there's no issues there and you don't have to do anything and you've not got drivers in your ear going, eh. And then a fantastic double stack under the safety car, which worked perfectly for them. All round, just an incredibly solid weekend for McLaren. Could McLaren domination bore fans? I have to say there is a very real threat that the answer to that question could be yes, purely because if these two just sort of take race wins away from one another and there isn't any real fight between them, then yes, it will get a bit boring. Like, we are being promised on all fronts, from McLaren itself, from Zak Brown, that these two drivers can race and there will be this big knockout battle between the two of them for the championship. And right now, I'm just not seeing it. I'm really not seeing that this big battle or anything's going to come. I actually think that the situation's maybe getting read a bit wrongly, because so far it's either one driver winning and the other's a bit behind, or it's a 1-2, but there's such a clear gap between the two of them. There's no real big battles happening outside. And I think that, yes, it's too early to be imposing any kind of orders and stuff like that, but McLaren do need to be a bit careful, because we've seen it in the past, the teammate rivalries. You know, it's not that long ago that you have to look at the Rosberg and Hamilton era and see what happened there. But you also don't have to look that far back and see what happened when there was a little bit of an on-track spicy battle between the two McLaren drivers. Just go to Monza last year when Piastri pulled that move on Norris to take the race lead, and it looked like there was fractures appearing. How the rest of the year will go, how it's all going to shake out in the wash. And listen, we won't know until it does, and I'm just very intrigued to see what happens later down the line. And I do think that, listen, they are absolutely untouchable now. It seems that way, that they are completely untouchable. In terms of the constructors, we'll sort of look at the points in a second, but it's a clean win for them. They'll win it very, very soon. There's not many. I can't remember what the margin is until they can't be caught anymore, but I can't imagine it'll be long before they win that championship, because they've got both cars this time scoring huge amounts of points. Whereas in 23, Red Bull only had Max scoring all those points, so it might have taken a little bit longer, but it's not going to be long before they've wrapped up that constructors title. And then the drivers, this has got the potential to go all the way down to Abu Dhabi. As I said, Oscar currently has a 10-point lead in the Drivers' Championship, but what's 10 points? Do you know what I mean? That's nothing. However, what I will say is that everything kind of is pointing towards Oscar for me. The fact that he's in his third year and is driving like this is insane. And yes, he's got a rocket ship under him, but his quali pace is huge. His race pace is huge. And he's probably, I think, one of the most well-rounded drivers on that grid at the moment. I've said it before. He's so impressive. I think it's an interesting one, but I'm leaning slightly towards the Oscar Piastri of it all. And, it could end up being that the season's been fun so far. It's been quite interesting, and there's been so much happening. And I think when you look at it as a whole, it's been quite spicy. I don't think it's the knockout, absolute banger season that we all thought it would be so far, but the title fight doesn't seem to be as tense. Maybe I'm just seeing it slightly different, but I don't see this being, right now anyway, a really sort of tense, hyped up title fight. I know there's only 10 points between them, but it just doesn't seem that chaotic yet, and maybe that'll come. And it probably will really heat up. It's almost like it happens every single year. You do your first half of the season, you go away for the summer break, and you come back and it's like everything's been turned up to a 30 out of 10. Like, everything just got a bit mental from the first race back after the summer break, and it just gets hotter and hotter and hotter and gets a little bit more chaotic every single race weekend until you get to Abu Dhabi. So yeah, I'm excited for the second half of the season and seeing what happens, but we've got a few races before we get there, so not to worry. But that is everything from us from a pretty chaotic Spanish Grand Prix. I was actually watching this race thinking just how much I'm going to miss this track when it leaves the calendar after this year. Like, it's such a good track, and I just love the track. I love the atmosphere. There's just something about Barcelona that is just it's a bit, I'm not going to say it's magical because that just sounds, again, I'm giving myself the ick, but I just love it, okay? I think it's a class track, and I'll be quite upset when it leaves. And I think quite a few of the drivers will be gutted when it leaves as well. So, but yeah, that's everything from us. We'll be back with our predictions for Canada very soon, which is obviously in 2 weeks' time. But make sure to follow along at Parc Fermé Parlay on all social media channels, and we will see you very soon. Enjoy the rest of your day. Love you. Bye.